Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gabriella Gallagher, and I'm the chair of Canadian Friends of Peace Now. I'd just like, before we begin our session today, to express the horror that our organization feels, and I'm sure I speak for most, if not all people, watching today at the appalling, murderous war that Putin has launched against Ukraine. This is a very sobering moment in world history. We can only hope for a speedy and just end to this war. Now, a word about Canadian Friends of Peace Now. We are partners to Peace Now, Shalom Achshav, which is Israel's leading peace movement, and which promotes the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can find out more about us on our website, peacenowcanada.org. We really hope you will consider supporting us with a donation, which you can do via our website. We rely entirely on donations from individuals like you. Our webinar today is on the alarming rise of settler violence, and it's co-sponsored by the New Israel Fund of Canada. NIFC helps fund one of the organizations represented here today, Breaking the Silence. We, of course, we help fund Peace Now. Our moderator today is CFPN Toronto board member, Jacqueline Schwartz, and she will ask our guests a series of questions. And after that, we'll have time for questions from the audience. Please type your questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat for questions. And also, please limit your use of the chat because many people find chat comments a distraction from the speaker event. If you wish, when you're typing in your questions, tell us where you're based. As you know, our webinar will be recorded and posted later to our website. And that's all the housekeeping business for now. So Jacqueline, over to you.
Thanks, Gabriella. Let me introduce our speakers, and I'll start with Dana Mills. She's the interim executive director of Peace Now, Shalom Achshav in Israel, and its director of development and external relations. She joined Peace Now in 1995, and she received her Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford in 2014 and has authored several books on political activism. Avner Gvaryahu is co-director of Breaking the Silence, an organization of veteran Israeli soldiers committed to making the Israeli public aware of the realities of everyday life in the occupied territory through soldiers' testimonies. Avner was born and raised in a religious Zionist family in Rehovot, Israel, and joined the IDF as a paratrooper in 2004. He served as sniper team sergeant in a special operations unit, mostly around Nablus and Jenin. And after his military service, Avner became involved with Breaking the Silence. Eventually, he became its co-director. So I think I'll start with you, Dana, because there is a recent report, the latest Peace Now report on the settler violence. And could you just say a few words about that?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us today and for raising this very important issue that has, as you said, been in a very alarming rise. So in November 2021, we published a report that basically showed that 63% of all events of settler violence that have been reported and monitored, I'll talk about that later, came out of illegal outposts. And specifically, there are 5 illegal outposts from which most violent incidents came. These are, I'm going to state them for general knowledge. We can expand on their characteristics later. Adea, Desh Kodesh, Yitzhar, Chomesh, and Givat Ronen. Some names might sound familiar to you because a lot of the events that have happened recently since November when the report came out came from these outposts. So this is one of those incidents where we're very sad to be vindicated in the sense that there is an overwhelming trend by which most settler violence comes from around illegal outposts. Now, there are very many characteristics that we can discuss around the phenomenon of settler violence, its implications towards the Israeli government, towards international law, etc. But the most immediate and urgent conclusion from our report and our stance towards this phenomenon is that in order to combat settler violence, you need to first evict illegal outposts, which, it might sound very intuitive to listeners of this webinar and to people who don't know how the occupation works and what is the reality of illegal outposts. But this is a fairly substantial stance and one that we have been pushing very strongly towards various parties we work opposite. And our stance is that we need to talk about how to evict those outposts and how to get rid of the source of settler violence rather than trying to police it superficially. So, of course, we need to talk about accountability. We need to talk about bringing those who are involved in incidents of settler violence to justice. But we need to think about the deeper source of those incidents. And that is broadly, of course, the occupation, but specifically, as this report has shown, the phenomenon of illegal outposts. So this is my main kind of message today. I'll obviously expand on it later, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Rick, Jacqueline, you're
sorry.
muted.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Can you characterize these violent settlers? Are they religious? Are they immigrants to Israel from, let's say, North America? Is there anything you can say generally about them?
I mean, maybe also Avner would like to talk about that later. We're not a human rights organization. We don't monitor the kinds of people who take part in those attacks. And actually, I should say, in parenthesis, that we worked on this report in collaboration with Yesh Din and data that they brought forth. And this data is already partial because a lot of Palestinians don't complain about incidents of settler violence because the accountability is so low. I don't want to talk about the settlers themselves because our focus is on the structures that uphold settler violence and not the settlers. The settlers are an outcome of structures that are funded and supported by, the state of Israel that me and Avner are paying taxes to. So, there are very different characteristics of violent settlers. There's all the people that you mentioned, and then there's others. But we as a movement don't oppose settlers. We oppose the settlement project. We oppose the government that funds and overlooks illegal instances of the settlement project. And that is our focus in policy, rather than talking about what kind of people take part in those activities.
Okay. Avner, whose responsibility is it to protect Palestinians from settler violence? Is it the police? Is it the IDF?
Well, that's a good question. A recent conversation within the Israeli cabinet showed that the chief of staff, Aviv Kochavi, doesn't actually know the answer or acts as if he doesn't know the answer. But before I get to that, I'll say, thank you so much for inviting me to meet you this evening. And I apologize if my puppy will be barking in the background. Didn't really manage to find the off button on that. I myself served as a paratrooper, as you mentioned, in the territories, and I served guarding settlements and outposts. Right, are both illegal under international law, but outposts are also illegal under Israeli law. And it's important to, as Dana mentioned, to talk about the structure of the outposts and settlements are sort of like, I think the analogy I like to use is sort of a ripple in a pond after throwing a rock or a pebble. The ripples of violence that a settlement or outpost create are integral to the system of occupation. And this is really detailed by the work of Peace Now, by the work of groups like Yesh Din. And the reality that I encountered as a soldier in the territories was the moment you're guarding a settlement, many times it's a short military mission, could be a week or 2 weeks. That's usually what is called regional guarding duty. You're given orders by a settler, right? The regional guarding officer is an ideological settler living in the settlement itself, gets his salary from the state, from our taxes, gets a weapon from the state, and he is the one that's in charge of the security of the settlement and working together, sort of hand to glove, with the soldiers. So when it comes to your question about whose responsibility is it, it's very clear whose responsibility it is. It's the occupying power and the military force who's in charge of the entire region. So the military, the army, which is in control of the region, can basically arrest, detain any individual, and that is definitely the case when it comes to Palestinians, as we very well know. But that is also the case when it comes to Israeli activists who support peace in the post-occupation. The military has no problem arresting, detaining Israeli citizens who are not settlers. But when it comes to the settler community, right, who are part of a criminal enterprise, without any doubt, definitely under international law and under Israeli law as well, the military refrains from using its rights and basically stands idly by, as many describe this reality. We detail in our testimonies, and I'll put our latest report here, but this has been coming up over the past 20 years, is that soldiers, young officers, are told repeatedly that their mission is not to stop, detain, or arrest violent settlers, but maybe stand in between the violent settlers and the Palestinians, and then call the police. Now, policemen are not roaming around the territories as frequent as military, but even more so, this touches the reason this happens, that soldiers are not doing their job or what they're responsible of as an occupying force, really shows this ecosystem, the symbiotic relationship between the military and the settler community, which shouldn't be surprising because the military is not built or is not structured to work with political pressure, right? Their structures, they're built to carry out orders, work in a security rationalization. But once you have a civilian population, right, a privileged civilian population living amongst people who are under military control, they're basically exploiting the situation, not only this occasional harm, violence, which is really horrific, but more importantly, in order to expand the settlement enterprise, and while they're expanding the settlement enterprise, they're minimizing, attacking, shrinking the space of Palestinians, pushing them into more confined territories, which is, the exact mission of this violence.
Mhm. Is there a growing sense of outrage or even action among the Israeli public? And which parts of the Israeli public?
I think that if we try to sort of very generally sort of break down the position of Israeli citizens on this issue, we definitely don't have a clear right and left, right? On many issues we don't, but definitely on this issue. And I would say that the biggest sort of camp in Israel today, and this is also you can see this in the Knesset, is what I would call the control camp, right? It's people that don't want annexation, but aren't necessarily, with us enough politically. They're fine with the status quo. It doesn't mean that they love it, but between the river to the sea, there's only space for one sovereign country, and that's Israel. Right? That's a pretty large chunk of Israeli society. People who are not centrist but middleist, like Lapid, Gantz, right? And Netanyahu, for most of his political career, was there till he moved to a different camp, which is the annexation camp. Right? The people in the annexation camp want, full-scale apartheid. Right? Their vision is an unequal reality and entrenching the current reality. They're sort of our political opponents. And then to the left is where I believe many of us are, hopefully in this conversation, are part of the equality camp. Right? And if we have to pull people from the control camp to the equality camp, that's sort of part of the work of groups like Peace Now and breaking the silence and so on and so forth. So I think that we definitely can say that with all my criticism to this government, and I have a list of criticisms to this government, and definitely led by settlement apologist supporter Bennett, with Netanyahu on the sidelines and with Meretz and Labor within the coalition, one thing we do see is that there's more space for us to work. It doesn't mean the occupation is doing any worse. Space for us to work, more work within parliament, meetings with ministers and so on and so forth. And there we've seen, for the first time in a very long while, we've seen actual political conversations also on this issue, right? So the Israeli public is talking about settler violence, and the Israeli public is showing its support with anti-occupation movements and organizations. We're not the majority yet. We don't have the power to put forward what we believe in, but there definitely is a shift in conversation. And I think we've seen this recently, actually, and this will maybe touch a little bit of the role that you guys can play as well. The international community, Jews around the world, we've been pushing. Many of us have been trying to push both Omer Bar-Lev, Minister of Interior Affairs, and Benny Gantz, Minister of Defense, to speak out against settler violence. Both of them have been really outspoken before taking office, but then very much kept their silence when taking positions, and they have the power to change it. And we pushed them and challenged them and put billboards on buildings and on buses. But the first time that Bar-Lev actually addressed this was when the American Undersecretary of Blinken was visiting, and the U.S. administration was challenging him about the issue of settler violence. Bless you. Was challenging him on the issue of settler violence, and that basically put him in a position where he had to address the issue, and that became a topic that the Israeli public was talking about. Now, that doesn't mean that we're close to stopping it or fundamentally changing, dismantling outposts or pushing soldiers to carry out their rights to stop settler violence, but we are talking about it. So therefore, we believe that more pressure, definitely our pressure on our elected officials, but also questioning this reality from abroad, from people who support Israel but oppose the occupation. We believe that this is a key in also helping us putting this issue on the table.
Great. Dana, would you like to address the issue of diaspora, how important the diaspora is?
Yes, definitely. So as Avner said, a lot of the conversation locally here started after the conversation between Bar-Lev and international bodies. And I think, we as a movement, Peace Now focuses on pressure internally within Israel, but it's undoubtedly influenced by discussions around the world, by questions raised by the diaspora and people like yourselves, because you are funders of a lot of the projects that are going on in the territories. diaspora money we know flows through various channels, whether you like it or not. I'm guessing if you're on this webinar, you do not like it. Supporting the state of Israel from afar means also being critical towards its oppressive policies, towards how it treats its citizens, like ourselves, who are not being accountable to, and how it treats Palestinians under 55-year-old soon-to-be military occupation. So I think, the pressure that you can place through Jewish body, through asking your governments questions, through raising issues on social media, through reposting. We specifically issue a lot of material in English for that reason. We know that in these instances, this is very effective. I do want to come back to your question to Avner about legitimacy in this government, because I think this is also very key for us, and I think it's important that your viewers, listeners will hear that. Peace Now, anecdotally, said that in your introduction of me, the last time that Peace Now has been in conversation with the government was when I was 13 and joined Peace Now as a teenager. And I have turned 40 this year. So this is a big moment for us. And it's a very long arc that we have gone through for having partners in the coalition with whom we can talk, questions that we can raise, policies that we can advocate. As Avner said, it's not that we're very pleased with what's going on. We published a report just before the report that I mentioned earlier called Government of Change for the Worse. Because if you look at policies towards settlements, if you look at policies towards occupation, this government is actually worse than its predecessor, ironically. But we do have conversations that we haven't had in nearly 30 years. And this is very important. When it comes to issues such as settler violence, both Breaking the Silence and Peace Now were present in a testimony kind of policy committee in Knesset where we could raise this issue. We heard testimonies from people injured through instances of settler violence. This could not have been dreamt of over the past 13 years, and this is very important. And, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. You have to break through all these structures that have been built through many, many years. And it's a very hard work. This is why we so appreciate your support, and we need it in all sorts of ways that you offer it. But we are able to get into places that we had not gotten again since I was 13. So, this is a very interesting and difficult and confusing and also very exhilarating and important time for us to do the work we do. And we are also able to reach new audiences. And I'm going back to the first question you asked me about the kind of reach of audiences and support within Israeli society, which, as Avner said eloquently, is polarized, and it has, affluency of opinions on everything, including this. But we are able to reach people who for years thought that the left is a demon, that we are traitors, that we are unpatriotic, and now feel more emboldened to speak up and to support anti-occupation movements and to speak for the Israeli interest, which is to end the occupation and to work for a two-state solution. So for us, this is really the money time and the time to push forward full steam ahead.
Thank you. Do you credit social media with any of this change, or where is this change coming from?
Yeah, I mean, everything. We work as a movement. We work in legal structures. We appeal constantly on various issues to different strata of courts. We work in lobbies, meaning opposite the Knesset. We work in other forms of lobbies, whether it's the JNF, another organization which had a lot of engagement in the occupied territories, or other organizations where it's important for our voice to be heard. But of course, social media is a very important form of activism right now. So we still organize demonstrations and marches. And just 2 weeks ago, we organized, actually a week and a half ago, a large demonstration in Evyatar, which is an illegal outpost that this government is trying to legalize in a backroom deal. Although there is a wide consensus against it, up to Yesh Atid, not very natural coalition partner for us. But in this case, they support our position that legalizing Evyatar is a dangerous move. And, the topic of this webinar, settler violence, we know what happens when illegal outposts get more and more normalized. So, it's time to stop this in the bud before we get to instances of settler violence. So we work in all these avenues. Social media is really very important. We still work face-to-face advocacy all time, like, demos, marches, sit-ins, everything. Everything, I would say.
Okay. Avner, Is there any change in the training in the IDF? Are they sort of making soldiers aware, new soldiers aware of the problems of settler violence?
So I'll read you guys a testimony of a guy who served just a few years ago in Hebron, and I'll try to answer that. This is an officer who served in Hebron, one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and the only one where in the heart of it is Israeli settlement, if you exclude East Jerusalem. So he says, you're asking me where I saw violence in Hebron. It's like asking where I saw Hebron in Hebron. It's really every corner. You just leave your post and you're already on a street that separates people according to their ethnicity or nationality.
Yeah.
I'll continue on. I won't read all of it. The mission there is not to maintain order. The mission there is to enforce Jewish supremacy in the city of Hebron. It's not that we soldiers are between a hammer and an anvil, but rather we are the hammer being hurled at the Palestinians by the settlers. So, I mean, I think when you read soldiers' testimonies and when we speak to soldiers who have served recently, it's amazing to see, even though how much has passed and how much has been documented, how similar their testimonies are to soldiers 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years ago. When it comes to the issue of the settler community, there's a fear of the military, and again, as I mentioned before, also echoed by the chief of staff, there's a fear to deal seriously with settler violence. We actually went out a few weeks ago and met soldiers, handing them the official orders. Right? We put together a small booklet with some testimonies and the official orders about their responsibility to detain or to stop settler violence. But the face of it, there is really an attempt by the military, with pressure by the settlers, to say leave settler violence to Israeli police instead of allowing soldiers to stop it. Now, it's not that I think that if soldiers will suddenly follow their orders, things will dramatically change, because we're talking about a political structure that doesn't allow it. But the first thing that we think is necessary is for soldiers to understand the fact that they have the responsibility to stop settler violence. I will just add one thing that we're talking about settler violence, but it is important to mention. It's really a spike in the past year and a half in settler violence all over the West Bank. We operate often in the South Hebron Hills, which is really one of the centers of settler violence, attacks on families, children, and interestingly or dangerously, what was in the past sort of at the edge of Palestinian communities, or attacks that were geared towards shepherds or so on. Now we see settlers actually going into the Palestinian communities, and this is extremely dangerous and scary. But one thing that we've also noticed is more military involvement in some of these attacks. Cases that were documented in the South Hebron Hills where a settler actually took a gun from a soldier and shot at Palestinians. This was videotaped. But a short anecdote: we had a guy who served also very recently an elite unit in the Nachal Brigade, who shared with us that someone in his unit, who was a soldier, right? That's what he does for 3 years, was also a settler living in Itzhar, right? Which is one of the more violent settlements in the West Bank. And this soldier, who was home for the weekend, was caught on video by a Palestinian who was filming. This guy who was wearing his military uniform, holding his rifle, his gun, his military gun, burning. This video is out, burning a Palestinian wheat field, right? So when we talk about the symbiotic relation of soldiers and settlers, and the fact that these settlement outposts are really these centers of violence, then we have to also remember that it's not as if the military and the settlers are totally disconnected, right? 50% of officers who finish officer school are part of the religious nationalist community. So I also grew up in the religious nationalist community. Doesn't necessarily mean, you vote for the far right, but there is a correlation there. But I think it really, also echoing what Dana said, this is much deeper than a bunch of troubled youth, right? This is state violence. This is violence which is backed by the state, and in the end of the day also allows or supports some of the elements or projects that the state is pushing for or hoping for.
And is this hope that Palestinians will simply leave?
I think in some cases we definitely see that is the case. There's an excellent report by Yesh Din that talks about this in the Shiloh Valley. You really see a massive area, beautiful area that for years was sort of where Palestinians were living off the land. Slowly but surely, the settlements expand. You have sterile buffer zones around them, special security areas that are basically sterile buffer zones. Palestinians lose their land, and then settlements expand into these territories. This is an entire valley. There's many examples of this, but this is an entire valley where basically you see how the Palestinians have lost massive areas and are pushed into the urban areas, into area A and B. Sort of 126 islands of urban areas where 60% of the West Bank, which is area C, which is in between. That's the sort of Swiss cheese analogy. We're gobbling up the cheese.
We've seen video, those of us in the peace camp have seen videos of peace volunteers trying to protect olive groves and Palestinian individuals. Is that happening more? And how does the military view that? Either or both can answer.
I'll start. I'll talk about peace, you talk about military, and that's the division of labor. So we went, in context, olive harvest season is one of the most dangerous for Palestinians to work on their own land and to go and harvest their olives. And of course, if you don't harvest in time, then you lose your produce. And this is an economic harm that is implied by the acts of violence. It's really important to talk about settler violence as a wide scope of the phenomenon, meaning it means both harming individuals, people, but it also means vandalism. It also means sometimes violence against animals, against the livestock and livelihood of Palestinians in certain farms. So in the fall has been one of the most violent that we can remember, and specifically the attacks on olive harvests were such that kind of made media and made the news. And after that, we, Peace Now, joined in a solidarity action and went on an olive harvest, which I have to say I went on personally. It was a very important, it was a very moving experience because, solidarity is a verb. It's something, it's about doing something. It's about creating something. It's about countering action with the productive and generative action. So it felt a very important thing to do, and we'll definitely do that in the future, although the hope is that we'll have less settler violence to counter and we'll have to do that less. There was also a tree planting solidarity action that both Breaking the Silence and Peace Now were party to not so long ago after a very violent attack in Burin. So this is something that is ongoing, but of course depends on the seasons and on the kind of solidarity that Palestinians require. And the advantage for us working with Palestinian communities is that we need to be aware and we need to know what it is that is needed for solidarity to be substantial and generative and not only performative. But again, I do want to sort of talk about my first point and make it very clear that, the images, I talked about how these news are getting to new audiences. And, some of the images are really shocking, but a lot of the instances that don't make the news or don't make the media, very sadly, Israeli media usually shows instances in which Israeli activists are attacked. Instances in which Palestinians are attacked don't always make the news and definitely don't shock in the same way that those incidents in which Israelis are injured are considered shocking. But for me, when I look at statistics, and we very often get reports as they happen, incidents of very severe vandalism, of hurting people's livestock, of hurting people's livelihood. One of the most deep things about Palestinians, their connection to the land going years and years back, generations and generations back, severing that is, it's an act of violence on so many levels. It's an economic act of violence, it's a personal act of violence, and it's a historic and symbolic act of violence, severing someone's connection to their land and to their heritage. So we need to think about settler violence as a very broad family of phenomena, and not just, the very shocking images that we sometimes like to focus on.
Right. And Avner, the military aspect.
Yeah. So is the question, what are the responses of the military towards the Israelis, or generally?
The military.
Yeah, I mean, I think the military has really been, complicit in a lot of what we've been talking about. The situations of extreme violence, as we mentioned earlier, wouldn't have happened if there was more of if the soldiers would actually do more in preventing or arresting settlers. I think that when it comes to more the situation or what's been happening more recently, we can really see the weakness of the military in preventing settler violence, even though this has become an issue that both eventually Lapid, Gantz, Bar-Lev, everyone addressed. Still, talk is cheap, tweets are easy, but there's no dramatic shift that we see on the ground, and definitely nothing that at least that we're hearing from soldiers that can indicate otherwise.
Thank you both of you, and I think we're going to turn it over to all these questions from the audience. So, Gabriella.
Thanks a lot. So we have a bunch of questions. And I remind audience to put them in the Q&A. It's much easier for me to just look at one source of questions. So first we have some from Arthur Milner, and I believe he's in Ottawa, my city. I'm not going to ask all 5 of your questions, Arthur, so that we can allow other people to have their chance. But he asked, first of all, because you've mentioned about, you've talked about illegal outposts, and he says, aren't all instances of settlement illegal?
Okay.
So maybe I'll ask Dana that one. And then one more from Arthur again. Yeah, how come the whole world does nothing about settlements which are almost universally regarded as illegal? So we'll get you to answer.
So excellent question, Arthur. Thank you. By international law, all settlements are illegal. By Israeli law, there is a process by which settlements can be bureaucratically approved and become part of the Israeli body politic. This is an important and difficult contradiction that we work with. So, as everything, it depends who you ask. Of course, we in Peace Now are working against the settlement project as a whole, but we know very well that some settlements that have been, built and developed for years, such as Ariel, which is a large town in the West Bank, are illegal by international law, but likely in any peace agreement will be part of, the future Israeli states side by side by the Palestinian state. On the question of what can we do, that's a really important point for the diaspora, actually, and something around, we as a movement talk a lot about differentiation between settlement goods and the settlement as a body and the state of Israel. We are not a pro-boycott movement. We do not support BDS as a movement. There's a variety of opinions within the movement itself, but we do talk about, boycotting settlement goods and supporting those kind of boycotts. And one example of that was, of course, the Ben & Jerry's move this summer, where, to remind our audiences, Ben & Jerry's announced that they won't sell their ice cream to settlements anymore. So these are actions by which you can remind the world and Israel that living in the settlements comes with a price tag. So it's an important question. It's a complicated one. By Israeli law, some settlements can be legalized, but you can still put political pressure, economic pressure, etc., to make clear that this is not approved internationally.
Okay, thank you. And we have a lot of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. This one is from David Cohen, and it's for Avner. And he says, to my knowledge, Breaking the Silence has not expressed publicly its position on apartheid towards Palestinians in the territories. That he means the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and in Israel proper towards Arab Israelis. So what is your position, if any?
Great, thank you. Definitely a lot of conversation about apartheid in the past year and a half, some pretty important reports that were put out. Our mandate is very clear. We gather testimonies from soldiers serving in the occupied territories. So when it comes to Israel proper, we feel that's not really our mandate. We expressed our support in the various reports that came out, the legitimacy of the reports, from Amnesty to Human Rights Watch to B'Tselem. Our position will not and does not talk about Israel proper. In the occupied territories themselves, we definitely believe that there is an apartheid reality. We didn't come out with an official position because it's not really our expertise, but it is part of the language that we use. And I think specifically when it comes to the reality or the situation in the territories, we point people to the Yesh Din report, or the report written by Michael Sfard about the reality in the territories. I really recommend, very important, good read.
Thank you. Here's a question from Wolf Ehrlichman. When settlers take generational land, could that be considered cultural genocide?
Yeah,
maybe
I think definitely. And I think, again, the point that I made earlier about seeing settler violence as a wide phenomenon, an attack on someone's history, an attack on someone's connection to the land, on their ancestral connection to the land. I know that in Canada, it's a very important topic for yourselves also. We need to understand that as a totality of what we're working against. And again, that's why we're talking about structures and not people, and not just bringing 2 or 3 violent settlers that the court, bringing them to justice. Of course, this is also important, but we're talking about the structures that enable this phenomenon and also legitimizes this part of taking control of the land.
Okay. Bob Cates asks Avner to describe Breaking the Silence and its activities. Avner, you've spoken a little bit about that, but is there anything more? You've talked about the soldier testimonies. Do you want to enlarge on that at all?
Yeah, I will just say we've been around since 2004. We were formed by a group of 60 soldiers that served together in Hebron during the peak of the Second Intifada. So the Intifada, Second Palestinian Uprising, took place around the early 2000s, ends around 2004, and a group of soldiers who serve in Hebron, which is really one of the bloodiest places during this Intifada. Many Israelis killed, soldiers killed, many more Palestinians, decide to break their silence. We believe that silence is not an Israeli epidemic. Every society has its silences, and this is our silence, and this was our silence to break. And with the photo exhibit, pictures that soldiers took while they were serving, turned into a photo exhibit that was presented in a gallery in Tel Aviv, they basically wanted to bring Hebron to the Israeli public sphere. And that's really what we've been doing ever since, continuing to gather soldiers' testimonies. We met over 1,300 men, women who have served in the territories, different positions, different times, different places, not only combat soldiers, but soldiers sitting behind desks and giving orders that affect Palestinian lives, but a lot of testimonies that have to do with the day-to-day life of control of Palestinians. And the second thing we do is educational work, talks, meetings, tours, lectures, and that's pretty much our work. Our aim is to shed a light on this reality in order to bring an end to the occupation. We're not hoping to better it or make the occupation more moral. We believe military occupation is immoral and therefore has to end. And the perspective that we're bringing forward is not a classic human rights approach, but we're not the victims in the situation. We were victimizers. I was a sergeant of a snipers team myself. I entered homes, woke people up in the middle of the night, and part of this work is us trying to take responsibility, and together with our community in Israel and friends and partners in the occupied territories, try to be a force of not coexistence but co-resistance to this reality, and hopefully we can be part of a change for a better future to the region.
Thank you, Avner. So we're quickly moving along towards the hour, so try to get a couple more questions in. Charles Cohen, I think he perhaps didn't quite, he's wondering how you can oppose the settlement enterprise, Dana, and not oppose the people who have implement the settlement enterprise, that is the settlers. So it's taking issue with something you've said before.
I mean, we want to fight structures. The settlement enterprise is funded by our government. A lot of people go to live on the other side of the Green Line because it's cheaper. It's made available to people for various reasons, made kind of more approachable. I don't know if you heard, but Tel Aviv was voted the most expensive city in the world recently. Israel is a country that has growing financial discrepancies. And a lot of people go to live in the settlements are decent people who can't afford to live elsewhere or who were convinced to go and live there. Topically, we're talking about Russia, Ukraine a lot. After the great immigration from Russia, when I was a kid, actually in the 90s, a lot of people were sent to live there without knowing. They were told, here's a house in Ariel, go live there. So we want to talk about the structures that send people there, the structures that fund them, and not oppose people. And I have to say, personally, I don't want to fight with people who are part of, the body politic that I live in. I want to talk about the people who fund them and allow them to live in places that are illegal and that damage my interest. We are all part of the same people, whether we like it or not, and we have to fight the structures to put those divides between us and not each other. That doesn't help anyone, I think.
Okay. All right. A couple of questions about whether you can use the courts to stop settler violence. I'm not sure that. Again, I think that's more of a question for Dana than for Avner, but either of you can go ahead.
I mean, that goes back to something I mentioned earlier, which is that there's a very low rate of reporting of many instances because Palestinians know there'll be no convictions, there'll be very little arrests. We, again, work, that's kind of also related to the previous question. We want to talk about the structures, about the settlements from which the settlers come, rather than talk about specific people and arresting them, etc. Of course, we want to see arrests as part of a process of accountability. And if there's any facade of a rule of law, it has to do, this at the very least. But, the point of appealing to courts when they're very little arrest, when there's very little implementation of law really on the ground, it's very performative. We want to, again, to talk about who are the people who send those young people, sometimes older people, to live where they are and to perform those acts of violence and let them get away with it, which is, as I go back to myself, the settler organization as a whole.
Great. Well, there's a question from Alex Zisman addressed to Breaking the Silence, but I'll ask it to both of you, actually. They said the previous government wanted to prevent breaking the silence from lecturing in schools. What is your current involvement in schools now? And I think that's a question we can ask Dana as well. So Avner, why don't you go ahead first?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that Netanyahu was very, very successful. This isn't only a Netanyahu effort, but Netanyahu was very successful in building around him. Mostly when he was out of politics, but then sort of carrying them in with him when he was prime minister, elected back in 2009. A lot of what I would refer to as gongos, government NGOs, right-wing organizations that are very, very active. Some of them get a lot of support from North America, Europe, and this environment, sort of bad civil society actors, were very, very important in pushing for the delegitimization of many members of our community, and we were sort of in the center of these delegitimization attacks. One of the attacks or attempts to silence us, there were many different laws, bills that were attempted to pass, delegitimize our supporters and funders, from the New Israel Fund that had smear campaigns in city centers of Tel Aviv to reports on European funders. One of the attempts was to pass a bill. This was when Naftali Bennett was Minister of Education, and he pushed a bill together with Yair Lapid, but other members from the right, to attempt to prevent us from meeting high school students. Practically, they didn't succeed. The bill passed, but it doesn't really affect us. But there was a chilling effect. We do see in recent years more of the schools that sort of shined away a bit coming back and wanting to meet us. There is one example that I think is very telling. A school that invited us, the parents, the students, the kids all wanted us, but then there was pressure from the Ministry of Education, and the event was canceled. The students themselves, on their own spare time, decided to organize themselves and invite us to meet them in the house of one of the students. So, they close a door, we enter through the window. But we definitely believe that some of these energies, movements are still working. The right-wing organizations are still very much alive, but today have a bit less of political power, which gives us, as I mentioned earlier, some more space to breathe and operate.
Dana, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, we are not an educational movement. We work as a protest movement. We organize politically. This is our raison d'etre. From the moment the movement was founded in the late 70s, throughout the Lebanon War, of which we're marking 40 years this year, throughout the struggle that we've been engrossed in since the 90s, really. And we usually work in different places, different forms. We did feel the effects of this law, and in general, I would say the chilling effect of a lot of Netanyahu's actions around the NGO sector and progressive movements of various sorts. But our position is such that we never probably try to enter schools, so it's not a direct effect on us. But I do want to say that I'm taking a page from something that Avner said a couple of days ago. I joined the very excellent tour that Breaking the Silence led in Hebron, and Avner talked on the way back about the process of de-Bibization, of kind of trying to get away from an ethos of oppression of freedom of speech, oppression of dissent, labeling a lot of us as someone who is dangerous to Israel, etc. And we're just coming out of that period. It's very early days for us. We're talking about less than a year for this government to be in office. So again, your support and your contribution is vital more than ever, because the state isn't still ready to deal with us as a community without any kind of external, I would say, backing and maybe a kind of support network that I know personally, both morally and politically, helps us very much. So your support at this time is crucial more than ever. We very deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. Can we ask one more question and then wrap it up? I think because Murray Rubin has asked a whole bunch of them. Let me just see. Well, he wants to know who's more responsible for the lack of negotiations, the Israelis or Palestinians, or both equally. Dana, do you want to give a statement?
I don't think it's helpful to do the blame/responsibility. Could say also the Americans, which since the Biden, office took off, Biden administration took office, hasn't really pushed towards any kind of negotiations. But I think we need to change structures from the ground. We can't just talk about who is more responsible. We all are parties to this.
Okay, well, we are out of time. Thank you both very much. And thank you, Jacqueline, also. Thank you to our speakers, especially for your very interesting, thought-provoking analysis and giving us your time, and for all the important work you do. Thank you, Jacqueline, for those great questions, and to our audience for your many questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We had tried to get to many of them. Do go to our website, peacenowcanada.org, to learn more about us, to donate. Take care, everyone, and stay tuned for future webinars, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks.